The bells of St. Aldwyn rang the noon hour across the frost-stiffened fields, and at the iron gate of the Hartwell Foundling House, a girl of 19 stood with a basket of bread on her hip and waited for the carriage to pass her by, as carriages always had. The bread was for the small ones who could not yet reach the high shelves in the kitchen, and her hands, though raw at the knuckles from the well water, held the basket as steadily as a woman who had carried far heavier things. She wore a gray wool gown that had been turned twice and let down once, the hem touched with the pale dust of the chalk road, and over it a thin shawl the color of weak tea. The carriage did not pass her by. It slowed at the gate, and from behind its glass, a gentleman looked out at her with an attention so still and so complete that the matron beside her drew a sharp breath and said, under it the word "the parish" had hung around the girl's neck since the night she was found on the chapel step, frost on her lashes, and no name pinned to her blanket. Cursed. To the village of Hartwell, she had always been the cursed one. The foundling no family would take, the child whose arrival a hard winter had followed, the girl the almshouse kept, only because no one else would have her, and the law required she be kept somewhere. They had decided this about her before she could speak, and she had spent 19 years. Learning that a verdict spoken often enough begins to sound like weather, like something that simply is. What the village did not know, what no one at the gate knew that frozen noon, was that the gentleman in the carriage had come to Hartwell for one reason only, and that the foundling house she had been raised inside was about to change hands in a way that would unmake every certainty the parish held about who she was. Stay with me, and you will see the girl they would not look at become the woman the whole county could not look away from. Her name was Esther, and she had given herself the rest of it. Esther Lane. She had decided at 12. Because the lane behind the chapel was the first place she remembered being warm, a south-facing wall where the sun gathered in the afternoons and where an old gardener had once let her sit while he worked. The matron, Mistress Cruse, called her only Esther when she was pleased and the foundling when she was not, and she was not pleased often. The Hartwell Foundling House stood at the edge of the Cawood estate, a long, low building of gray stone with a slate roof that wept in the rain, 40 children inside it on a good year and 50 on a bad one, and it was kept on a charity endowment, left by a man none of them had met. Esther had grown from the smallest cot in the cold dormitory to the position the house never named aloud, but could not function without. She woke the little ones, she dressed the sick ones, she mended what tore and salted what would spoil and read aloud in the evenings from the one book the house owned. And she did all of it for nothing but her keep, because a cursed girl took what she was given and was grateful, or she took what she was given and learned not to show that she was not. The gentleman from the carriage was the new patron of the endowment, though Esther did not learn this until the following morning, when the matron swept into the kitchen with her color high and her voice pitched to carry. The Duke of Cawood had inherited the estate and everything tied to it, the matron announced to the room of working children, and the foundling house sat upon Cawood land and drew upon Cawood money, and they would all of them conduct themselves as though the Almighty himself had come to inspect the larder. He was a young duke, recently come into the title, and he was said to be cold. He was said to have buried someone. He was said to keep no company and answer no invitations and refuse the season entirely. And the village had already decided that a duke who would not dance was a duke with something to hide. Esther listened and salted the porridge, and thought nothing of it beyond the small, cold arithmetic of her life, which was that great men noticed great houses and never the people scrubbing their floors. She was wrong about being unnoticed, though she would not know it for some time. The Duke had seen her at the gate. He had seen the steadiness of her hands and the particular way she had looked at the carriage, not with the hunger the village showed his money, nor the fear it showed his rank, but with a flat, clear assessment, the look of a person measuring whether a thing would help her charges or harm them. His name was Adrian, the Duke of Cawood, and he was 29. And he had come north to the estate he had not wanted to inherit because his brother was dead, and the inheriting could not be refused. He carried in the breast pocket of his coat a thing he had told no one about, and his hand went to it now as the carriage rolled up the drive, the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth, and he did not take it out, and he said nothing to his steward about the girl at the gate. What he felt, he did not yet have a name for. He only knew that he had looked at her longer than a duke looks at a foundling, and that the looking had cost him something he could not account for. The inspection came 3 days later. The matron had the children scrubbed and lined and silent, and she walked the duke through the dormitories with a running account of her own economies and sacrifices, how she stretched the flour, how she turned the coal, how she labored without thanks for the ungrateful poor. Esther stood at the back with the youngest child on her hip. A boy of 4 named Tom, who had a weak chest and cried in the night, and she kept him quiet by letting him hold her finger. And she watched the duke move through the house she had built inside the house the matron ran. He asked the matron questions, and the matron answered them, and several of the answers were not true. He asked how often the children were fed, and the matron said 3 times, and it was twice. He asked whether the sick were seen by a physician, and the matron said always, and Esther had set Tom's last fever herself, with a vinegar cloth and a cool hand, because no physician would climb the hill for a foundling. Esther said nothing. A cursed girl did not contradict the matron in front of a duke. Yet the duke had stopped before her, and he had looked at the child on her hip, and he had asked the boy his name. And Tom, who feared everyone, had looked up at the cold young duke and said it plainly. And then he had pointed at Esther and said, "She keeps me." The duke's eyes had moved to her face and stayed there a moment too long, and the matron had said brightly that the foundling was useful enough in her way, the cursed always being good for the work no one else will do, and the duke had said nothing at all, and the silence after the matron's words had a weight to it that Esther did not understand. That night she could not sleep, and not because of Tom's cough, which she had eased with honey she had no right to, and would answer for if it were missed. She lay in the narrow cot at the end of the dormitory, where the draught came hardest, the place she had taken so the small ones could have the warmer beds. And she thought about the way the duke had looked at her, and she was angry at herself for thinking about it. She knew what she was. The village had told her since the cradle. A man like that did not look at a girl like her, except to wonder, idly, the way the gentry wondered about the weather, whether she would last the winter. She turned to the wall and told herself the lesson she had taught herself 100 times, that hope was a luxury for the wanted, and that she was the unwanted, and that the unwanted survived by needing nothing. She believed it. Her body, which had felt the duke's attention like a hand laid flat against her spine, did not believe it at all. The duke did not leave Hartwell. This was the first thing the village noticed and could not explain. A great lord came to inspect his charity, and a great lord left. That was the order of things. But the Duke of Cawood stayed on at the estate through the turning of the month, and he was seen, more than once, riding the lane behind the chapel where the sun gathered. And he was seen, once, standing at the foundling house gate at an hour when no business could have brought him. The matron took his lingering as a judgment on her management, and grew sharp with the children, and sharpest of all with Esther, whom she set to the worst of the work, as though labor could scrub the curse off her and make the house respectable. Esther carried the coal and emptied the slops and walked 2 miles to the mill for flour because the cart wheel had cracked, and she did it without complaint, and she did not see the duke watching from the rise above the lane as she carried a sack that should have taken a grown man, watching the way she stopped to shift a younger child off the cold ground and onto her own back, rather than make him walk, watching her give away her bread at the gate to a beggar woman and eat nothing herself that the rise could see. He saw her on the day that decided him. Do a thing, she believed, no one saw. A tinker's boy of perhaps 10 had come to the gate at the gray end of the afternoon, his hand wrapped in a filthy rag, the flesh beneath it gone bad and swollen to twice its size, the sort of wound the village left to heal or kill as God chose because a tinker's child was nobody's business, and a tinker's child knew it. He had not come asking. He had come to be turned away, which was the only thing the world had taught him to expect, and he stood at the bars, with his shoulders already curved against the refusal. Esther had looked at the hand, and not at the boy's station. And she had brought him into the kitchen, against every rule the matron kept, and she had set him on the stool by the fire and heated water, and worked the foul rag loose, with a patience that did not once make him flinch. She cleaned the wound and drew the poison with a bread poultice pressed warm against the swelling. And when the linen ran short, she tore a strip from the hem of her own shift, without a moment's pause, and she bound the hand firm and clean. And she gave the boy the heel of bread that had been set aside for her own supper, and watched him eat it, as though she had eaten already, which she had not. And while she worked, she spoke to him fiercely and low, the way a person speaks who knows exactly the wound beneath the wound. She told him that he was not nothing. She told him that a hurt did not make a person less, that a body broken was still a body worth the mending, that whoever had taught him to expect the gate shut in his face had lied to him and would go on lying, and that he was not to believe it. The Duke stood at the kitchen window in the blue dusk and heard her say it, and he understood with a clarity that frightened him that she was not speaking only to the tinker's boy. He put his hand to his breast pocket again, to the thing he carried there. And for the first time in 2 years he took it out, and he looked at it in the last of the light, and he made a decision that a colder man would have called madness. What he carried was a miniature, a small oval portrait, in a worn brass frame. The paint cracked at one corner where his thumb had worried it. 2 years before, the Duke had been not a duke, but a younger son, with no expectation of the title, and he had loved a woman the family would not have, a vicar's daughter with no fortune and no name worth the having, and he had been a coward. He had let his father's voice, and his brother's mockery, and the whole cold weight of the family's expectation, persuade him that her unsuitability was her fault, that a man in his position could not afford a sentiment, that there would be other women better placed to be a coward. He had said as much to her in words he could no longer think of without nausea, and she had not argued. She had only looked at him with a flat, clear sorrow, and said that she had thought him braver, and she had gone home, and within the year a fever had taken her, and he had not been at the bedside, and he had inherited a dukedom he had bought with her at a price he had not known he was paying. The miniature was all he had kept. He had carried it north like a stone he could not set down. And when he heard a foundling in a cold kitchen tell a hurt boy that he was not nothing, he heard 2 years too late the thing he should have said to a vicar's daughter, and had not been brave enough to say, and he understood that the coldness the village laid on him was not pride, but grief wearing pride's coat, and that he had come north to be alone with it, and that he was not going to be alone with it after all. The Duke began to come to the foundling house openly, and the village did not know what to make of it. He came with a physician, a real one, who climbed the hill at last and saw to Tom's chest and to 3 other children the matron had let go untended. And the matron's economies were laid bare one by one, until her color was no longer high, but mottled, and her voice no longer carried. He came with a clerk who went through the endowment's accounts, and the accounts did not balance, and the difference had gone into the matron's own keeping over a span of years that made Esther's stomach turn when she understood it. All those twice-fed days, all those unwarmed nights, all that coal turned down while the matron's parlor stayed bright. And he came, the Duke, when his business was done, to the kitchen where Esther worked. And he stood in the doorway and gave her commands that were not commands at all. "Sit down," he said, when he found her swaying on her feet at the end of a 16-hour day. "Eat something," he said, pushing the untouched plate toward her across the scarred table. "Stop carrying that," he said, taking the coal scuttle from her hands with his own. A duke's hands, and the village would have fainted to see it. Esther heard the orders and bristled at them, because orders were what the matron gave, and she had survived 19 years by obeying the ones she must and quietly defying the rest. She did not hear, not yet, the thing folded inside them. She did not hear that a man who had once failed to protect someone was protecting her in the only grammar his grief had left him. Her body heard it. That was the trouble. When he took the scuttle from her hands, his fingers brushed hers, and she felt the warmth of it travel the length of her arm and settle somewhere beneath her ribs. And she stepped back from him too quickly, and she was furious at the stepping back, because it told him something she did not wish him to know. She began to know where he was in a room without looking. She would be bent over the mending, and the door would open, and she would feel the air change, and she would know it was him before he spoke, and she hated that her pulse answered the knowing. One evening he found her reading to the little ones from the house's single book, the lamp low and Tom asleep against her side. And he stood in the shadow of the passage and listened to her voice carry the story to its end. And when the children were abed, and she came out into the passage, she nearly walked into him in the dark. Too close, his breath stirring the loose hair at her temple, and for the length of 3 heartbeats, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back and bid her good night, his voice rougher than she had heard it. And she went up the cold stair with her hand pressed flat against her own breastbone, as though to hold something in. The village had begun to talk, and the talk found a shape, and the shape was ugly. A duke did not haunt a foundling house for the sake of 40 parish children. There was a girl in it, the talk said. The cursed one, the foundling. And a duke who would not dance at a proper ball was making free with a charity girl no one would miss. And was it not exactly what one might expect of the cursed, to tempt a grieving man from his sorrow and his duty? The matron, who had lost her economies and her parlor fire, and saw the duke's clerk drawing closer to the bottom of her accounts, took this talk and fed it. She told the vicar's wife, in a voice pitched to be overheard, that the foundling had always been sly, that she had seen the girl set her cap at the duke from the first, that the cursed were cunning, and a respectable house could not be too careful. The dismissive word that had ridden Esther since the chapel step found a second voicing in the vicar's parlor, and a third was coming. And Esther felt the village's regard cool around her like water closing over a stone. There was a woman the matron's talk found useful, and her name was Lady Margaret Ravensworth, and she had come to the county that autumn with a purpose. She was the daughter of the duke's late father's closest friend, a polished beauty of 23, with a fortune to match her name, and she had been raised on the understanding that she would one day be a duchess, and the new Duke of Cawood was the unmarried duke nearest to hand. She arrived at the estate as a guest of the duke's aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Cawood, who had come north when she heard her nephew was lingering in the country among the lower sort, and who had come specifically to put a stop to whatever folly kept him there. The Dowager was a woman of 70, who had spent every one of those years inside the order of rank, and could not conceive of a world arranged otherwise. And when she heard that her nephew had been seen taking a coal scuttle from a foundling's hands, she did not laugh. Because it was not funny, it was a crack in the foundation of everything she was. And she set about repairing it the way she repaired everything, with money and pressure, and the certainty of her own correctness. The Dowager and Lady Margaret called upon the foundling house, ostensibly to bring charity, in truth, to inspect the threat. Esther was brought before them in the cold parlor, her hand still gray from the morning's work. And the Dowager looked at her through a quizzing glass as one might examine an insect, and Lady Margaret arranged her skirts and did not look at her at all. The Dowager asked her name, and Esther gave it, Esther Lane. And the Dowager said that Lane was not a name, but a place, that a foundling had no more right to a surname than to a fortune, and that she would be Esther and nothing further while she stood in a Cawood house. Lady Margaret laughed, a small silver sound, and said it was a wonder the Duke could bear the smell of the place. And the Dowager, rising to leave, delivered the dismissive word for the 3rd time, and the cruelest, not to Esther's face, but past her, to Lady Margaret. In a voice meant to carry, "The cursed should be grateful," she said, "that anyone troubles to keep them at all." Esther stood very still, and let the words break over her, and she did not weep, because she had learned long ago that weeping was a thing the watched did, and the unwanted could not afford, and the Dowager swept out, satisfied that the foundling had been put in her place. The Duke came that evening, and he found Esther in the kitchen, and he saw at once that something had broken in her composure, the way a still pond shows the stone long after it has sunk. He asked what had happened, and she would not tell him. And he asked again, his voice level and low. And she turned on him at last with all the held anger of 19 years, and told him that he should not come any more, that his coming had made her a byword, that the village had a name for what she was, and now it had a name for what he was making her, and that he could afford the talk and she could not, that when he tired of the country and went back to his London life she would still be here, cursed and foundling and ruined besides, with 40 children depending on a house that could turn her out for the scandal he had brought to its door. She said it all in a rush, precise and honest and shaking. The one speech she had never let herself make, and the Duke stood and took it without flinching, and when she was done, he did not defend himself. He said only, quietly, that she was right, that he had been careless of her, and that he would not be careless again. And he left, and Esther told herself the relief she felt was relief, and not loss. The Dowager moved quickly, because the Dowager always moved quickly. Within the week she had arranged for the Foundling House endowment to be transferred to the management of a board of her own choosing, with the stated aim of restoring propriety and removing undesirable influences. And the first act of the new board was to give notice that the foundling called Esther was dismissed from the house for conduct unbecoming, and was to be gone by the quarter day. There was nowhere for her to go. The Dowager knew there was nowhere for her to go. A dismissed foundling with a ruined name and no character to recommend her had the workhouse or the road, and the Dowager, who did not think of herself as cruel, thought of herself as restoring a natural order in which a cursed charity girl returned to the obscurity she had risen above. Cruz, restored to favor under the new board, gave the notice herself. In the cold parlor with Lady Margaret seated by the window as a witness to the propriety of it, and she gave it slowly, savoring the giving, and she said as she handed over the paper that some stains could not be washed out no matter how a body scrubbed at them. Esther took the paper and read it, and did not weep, because weeping was a thing the watched did, and she had never been able to afford it, and she stood in the parlor where she had been put in her place a dozen times, and felt the floor of her whole life tilt and slide. That was the dark hour, and it was darker than any she had known, because it took from her not only her keep and her name and the roof she had earned 10 times over, but the children. It took Tom, who slept against her side, and woke crying for her in the dark, and quieted only at her voice. It took the little ones who reached for her hand in the cold dormitory, and the bigger ones she had taught their letters, and the sick ones she had sat up with, through the long night when no physician would climb the hill. She understood, standing there with the paper in her gray and trembling hand, that she was to be torn from the only thing she had ever loved, and that her love for the children was the very lever they had chosen to do it with, because the cursed were not permitted to love anything the order had not first approved. She did not go to the road. She did a thing, instead, that the cursed were not supposed to do, a thing that frightened her more than the workhouse, which was that she fought. She had been keeping, for years, in a tin beneath the loose board under her cot, every scrap of the house's true accounting she had ever come across, the real numbers of the real meals, the names and dates of the children who had sickened untended, a quiet record kept by a girl who had never expected to use it, and had only needed, somehow, for the truth to exist somewhere, even if no one ever read it. She took the tin to the one man she thought might listen, not the Duke, whom she had sent away, but the Duke's clerk, the sober young man who had been going through the endowment's accounts, and who had looked at her once in passing, not with the village's contempt, but with something like respect. She put the tin in his hands, and she told him plainly what it was, and she asked him only that the truth of what had been done to the children be known. Whatever became of her, the clerk took the tin to the Duke. And the Duke, reading by candlelight the patient 9-year record a cursed girl had kept of a cruelty no one had troubled to see, understood at last the full measure of what he had been careless of, and understood, too, that the woman he had sent away to protect her had handed him, in her own ruin, the means to set right far more than himself. The quarter day fell on the morning of the Cawood Winter Assembly, the largest gathering the county knew, held in the great hall of the estate, with every family of consequence, for 30 miles in attendance, the Dowager presiding, Lady Margaret arranged at her hand in ice-blue silk. The whole machinery of rank assembled to witness the new Duke take his proper place among them at last. Esther was not there. Esther was at the Foundling House gate, with a bundle of her few things waiting for nothing, saying goodbye to Tom through the bars, because the new board would not let her pass them, when the Duke's own carriage came down the chalk road and stopped. And the Duke's steward stepped out and said that His Grace requested her presence at the assembly, and that the carriage was sent for. She did not understand it. She nearly refused it. Yet Tom's small hand was through the bars and gripping her finger, and the steward said gently, for a steward, that it concerned the children. And so she went, in her turned gray gown, up the drive she had only ever walked, and into the great hall where the whole county stood in silk and candlelight and turned, as one, to look at the cursed girl come among them. The dowager rose. Her voice cut across the hall, asking what was meant by bringing a dismissed servant into a gathering of her betters, and the assembled families murmured, and Lady Margaret's lovely face arranged itself into distaste, and for a moment the old order closed around Esther, exactly as it always had. The verdict spoken, the weather settled. Then the Duke of Cawood crossed the hall. He crossed it, in the silence his rank commanded, past his aunt, past the ice-blue silk, past the whole arranged correctness of the evening, and he stopped before the foundling in the grey gown, and he took from his breast pocket the worn brass miniature, and held it a moment in his closed hand, and he reached out and took Esther's grey and roughened hand in his, before all of them, and he raised his voice so that no corner of the hall could pretend not to have heard. "This woman saved the children you abandoned," he said. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a great room full of people, rearranging, all at once, a thing they had been certain of. The Duke did not let it hang empty. He turned to the steward, and the steward brought forward the clerk, and the clerk brought forward the tin and the accounts beside it. And in plain, unhurried words the Duke laid out before the county what the records showed: the stolen endowment, the starved and untended children, the matron's theft and the board's collusion, and the part his own aunt had played in dismissing the one person in 9 years who had kept the children alive. He named the sums. He named the dates. He did not raise his voice, and he did not gloat. And that was worse for the dowager than any shouting could have been, because she could not dismiss it as passion. She could only stand and feel the foundation of her certainty give way beneath her in front of every family that mattered. She reached for her quizzing glass, and her hand did not find it. She began a sentence about the natural order, and could not finish it. The order she had served all her life looked back at her from the faces of her peers, and did not recognize her cause as its own. It was the dowager's solicitor, present at the assembly as such men always were, who made the displacement final, because the Duke had arranged that too. The endowment, it was revealed, had never lawfully been the dowager's to transfer, the founding deed having vested its patronage solely in the holder of the Cawood title, which was to say in the Duke himself, and every act of the dowager's board was therefore void, the dismissal void with it. And the Duke, holding still the hand of the woman the county had called cursed, announced what he intended to do with the patronage that was his and his alone. He would settle the endowment in trust, properly funded and properly watched, and he would appoint to its direction the one person who had proven beyond any doubt that she would spend herself entirely for the children's good. The Foundling House at Hartwell would be Esther's to govern. The cursed girl would own the house that had only ever suffered her, not in scandal and not in service, but in law and in honor, with the Duke's name and fortune standing behind her against any soul who tried to gainsay it. Lady Margaret left the county within the fortnight, and the dowager within the month, and neither was destroyed, only displaced, sent back to the world where their certainties still held, corrected rather than crushed, which was all the justice the Duke had asked for, and all that Esther, who had no taste for vengeance, would have permitted. Cruz was turned out of the house she had bled, and the board dissolved, and a physician kept on, and the children fed 3 times in truth, at last. And the talk of the village turned, as village talk does, and the cursed one became the foundling who owned the foundling house, and then simply Miss Lane who governed it. And the same mouths that had hung the word around her neck in the cradle found they could not quite remember having done so. The Duke did not declare himself in the great hall. He had learned 2 years too late and then in time that love announced before witnesses, for the witnesses' sake, was its own kind of cowardice, and he had no more use for the witnesses. He declared himself a fortnight later in the kitchen of the house that was now hers, in the blue dusk with the fire low and Tom asleep in the next room, and he did it not with a speech, but with the truth he had carried north like a stone. He told her about the vicar's daughter. He told her what he had failed to say, and what it had cost, and what he had learned, standing at a cold window, listening to a foundling tell a hurt boy. He was not nothing. He took out the worn brass miniature, and he set it on the table between them, not as a rival to her, but as a confession. The last weight he had to lay down, and he said that he had been a coward once, with a woman braver than himself, and that he did not intend to be a coward twice. Then he asked her plainly, the way he had learned to say the plain, true things, whether she would have him. And Esther, who had spent 19 years learning to need nothing, looked at the man across the scarred table and at the small portrait between them, and at the open door beyond which the children slept, and she let herself want at last out loud. They were married in the spring, in the chapel at St. Aldwyn, where she had been left on the step, and it was a small wedding, the children in the front pews scrubbed and beaming, Tom holding the ring in both hands as though it were a live thing. The Duke's clerk standing up as witness, and the village filling the back of the chapel, not because they were bid, but because they had decided in the way of villages that they had always known the foundling would come to something. Esther wore not the gray gown, but a dress of soft cream, and she carried no diamonds. And the Duke looked at her across the chapel with his cold reserve gone entirely from his face. And the parish that had called her cursed watched her married from the very step where it had named her, and found the naming did not fit any more, and let it fall. The first snow of the following winter came down soft over Hartwell, and in the warm front room of the foundling house, which was a home now and not a charity, a fire burned high in a grate that no one turned down. Esther sat by the window with Tom's head heavy and sleeping in her lap, and the other children scattered around the hearth with the new books the house could afford, and her husband across from her with the firelight easy on his face, and on the mantel above them, where she had set it herself and where it would stay, stood the worn brass miniature in its cracked frame, no longer a stone carried in secret, but a small kept thing in a house full of kept things. A girl remembered with honor in the home, another girl had been given. Esther looked at the snow falling past the glass, onto the grounds that were hers, onto the gate where a gentleman had once slowed a carriage to look at a foundling no one looked at, and she felt the old word lift off her for the last time and go out into the cold and not come back. She had been left here with no name and no one. She had stayed and kept the small ones warm, and waited without knowing she was waiting. The window she looked through was her own now, and the children breathing easy around the fire were her own, and the man watching her across the bright room had crossed a whole county of silence to take her hand where the world could see. She drew the sleeping child closer, and she did not look away from the snow. Thank you for staying to the end of Esther's story. If the quiet ones who keep the small things warm have ever mattered to you, I hope this stays with you a while.